the height of that movement in the 1990s, 1 in 5 Americans was saying that they had reduced their consumption, and they had done so happily. But that still leaves 4 out of 5 Americans that weren't doing that. So it's very difficult to spend your lifetime as an outsider in your own culture. And combine that with like a $600 billion advertising industry and all of the other forces that encourage us to consume. It's very difficult for us to do this as individuals. And that's why I think we need to look at these kinds of system level changes that can help make it easier for all of us to consume less. You know, changing the way we do business, changing something as simple as putting, in theory anyway, something as simple as putting lifespan labeling on products so that when you pick up, you know, 2 sweaters and one is more expensive than the other, you can see, oh, this one's more expensive in part because it's going to last 10 years and this one's going to last 10 wears, right? So if you think about those kinds of changes, they're concrete, real actions that we can take that will transform the actual system rather than loading it onto the individual to feel bad about, which is the approach we usually use.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director, and today we're delighted to have 2 well-informed experts, James MacKinnon, best-selling Canadian author, and Vincent Stanley from Patagonia Clothing, to help us own up to our part in the global climate problem, namely our crazy consumption. The Day the World Stopped Shopping is the title of James MacKinnon's latest book, which imagines what would happen to our economies, our planet, and ourselves if we bought less stuff. He proposes that if we could reduce our consumption by just 5%, it would make a big difference, and we would barely notice the shift. So it's time to ask yourself, what are you willing to give up to save the planet? Well, welcome first to you, James, who's joining us from the University of Victoria. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
It provides a very comprehensive account of how we reached this situation historically. And the chapters are peppered with research from all around the world, including a nice recipe for Kenyan soup made from sweet potatoes and mangoes, for anyone who likes soup. But more seriously, all the headlines yesterday were about this crisis in the supply shortage. Quote, America isn't running out of everything just because of a supply chain crisis. It's running out of everything because Americans are buying so much stuff. The New York Times said Americans' relentless purchasing has created shortages at the factory level, restricting what products can even be made or shipped. But before we go into the fashion industry, which is one of the chief culprits in terms of consumption and throwaways, let's look at some of the facts that you quote in the book. For decades now, you say we've witnessed an almost non-stop increase in the consumption of every major resource, from oil to gemstones, gravel to gold. We're using up the planet at a rate 1.7 times faster than we can regenerate. In fact, if everyone consumed like the average American, it would be 5 times faster. We currently spend about $250 billion a year just on digital gadgets. So 2 things. When did Americans become so needy, or should we say greedy? And when did this overconsumption start?
It's an interesting question because historians have gone back in time trying to find some precise point where even the human species became consumers, and they can find traces of our consumeristic type behaviors as far back as they care to reach. I mean, people were decorating hand axes not long after they invented hand axes, and they used the decorations presumably for the same kinds of uses we would, which is to show our taste and our individuality and maybe our status. But we certainly see in the 20th century a real acceleration in consumption, and particularly after World War II, at this point that some people call the Great Acceleration. That was the point at which consumption in the United States really just took off, and it probably happened for a couple of reasons. One was that in the decades previous to that, people they'd had their consumption restrained. And so at the end of World War II, people were really in the mood to have a consumer lifestyle. And there had also been these tremendous gains in industrial productivity. So there was enormous, and technology, there was enormous number of consumer goods available, and they were more affordable than ever. And people were in the mood to buy them. And we went from there, and we have really never slowed down.
So the overconsumption hasn't been a kind of a recent thing since the 60s or the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, the people who are studying when consumption in the United States went out of balance with what is a sustainable amount of resource use at a planetary scale say that the US probably passed that point sometime between the 40s and 70s, but nobody's really certain when that happened. But what we know at a global scale, the UN panel that studies global natural resources says that around the year 2000, consumption became the biggest driver of our environmental crises. So a bigger driver even than the growing population of the planet's people. And if you have trouble picturing how that works, the statistic that helped me think about it is the idea that right now, the average person in one of the world's richer countries consumes as much as 13 people in a poorer country. So if you picture a family of 4 in one of the world's richer countries, they're consuming as much as 54 people in a poorer country. And there's not a lot of 54-person families out there in any country. So you can really see how consumption is almost like a proxy for population. If you consume enough, it's as though you are consuming as a huge group of people.
So let's go back to this kind of concept of need versus greed. I wonder how much the corporate world has to take responsibility for ramming stuff down our throats, particularly feeding insecurities in the younger generation. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'm opening my computer this week and without my control getting pushed to buy the latest iPhone, which I don't want. And I didn't solicit that. So first of all, is that part of the problem, that they're not taking responsibility? And secondly, do you think stuff is a kind of substitute for connection in our lives now?
Yeah, I mean, going to the first one, I mean, who's responsible? I think it's really complicated. I mean, I think given the origins of consumption, for example, if we look at planned obsolescence, like this idea that products are designed to fail, if we look at the history of that, you would imagine that there was some point where an evil cabal of corporate heads got together and said, yeah, let's design things to break so that we can sell more and more of them. People have to replace those products. But if you look at the history of planned obsolescence, it's not really like that. There was a time when even leftist leaders and union leaders were saying, look, we have lots of resources and we have the capacity to produce a lot of goods. Let's do it. And we don't want to produce goods that are too high quality, because then people don't have to buy more and more of them, and that won't strengthen the economy. This was something that people spoke about quite openly in the origins of planned obsolescence. But since then, we've understood what the ecological consequences of planned obsolescence are, and our attitudes have changed about that. I think that's true of many things. Like early in the development of consumption, I don't think people thought there was any harm in using advertising to push people to buy a lot of products. And it was only as we gradually learned about the consequences that it's become a lot more questionable. And so now I think the question is, we know that driving people to consume is a very serious driver of environmental problems. And so now, how do advertising firms respond? How do corporations respond to the fact that that this is what they participate in at this point, and how might they change? Oh, and the question is, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I asked you a second question, which was, is stuff a kind of substitute for connection?
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of evidence that that's the case, that if you develop a consumer culture, then we use consumption for everything. We use it to show our love through gift giving. We use it to signal our identities through the choices we make and what we wear and drive and how we furnish our homes and all of these sorts of things. So I think as consumer culture has led to a disconnection between people, we have tried, and this is probably a feedback loop, but we have tried to fill up these states of disconnection with the joys of consumerism, because there is that dopamine hit that people get from buying a new thing and having it show up in a box and opening that box and pulling it out, all of those sorts of things. We've gotten very good at using consumption as a kind of proxy for real happiness and real life satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. So you said something interesting in the book. You said when people consume less stuff, we get immediate drops in emissions, resource consumption and pollution, unlike anything we've achieved with green technology, which was remarkable when I read that. So why are you not shouting this aloud at the COP26 conference?
Well, I mean, if they invited me, maybe I would, but I think the key point is that when I say this is just a plain truth. If we look at the increase in carbon emissions, then they climb all the way through the 20th and 21st centuries so far, with occasional mysterious dips. And those dips come around 1930. They come in the 1940s, the 1980s, mid 1980s, early 1990s, 2008, 2009, and the pandemic. So fans of history will recognize the pattern here, which is, on the one hand, those are all occasions when large numbers of people reduce their consumption, and it has this powerful effect on reducing carbon emissions, because every dollar spent in the consumer economy generates carbon emissions. The other thing all of those points have in common is that they were global disasters, wars, recessions, depressions, and the pandemic. So this is why this is a tough thing to shout from the rooftops, is because right now, the evidence we have and the impression we have is that if we reduce our consumption, it results in an economic catastrophe. So the question becomes, how do we harness the benefits of reducing consumption without triggering collapse?
Okay, so that's a very interesting point, because everyone, as soon as you say we've got to cut back on shopping, they've got ideas. We're all going to go around like Fred Flintstone, and that it's going to be dramatic. It's going to be, horrific. It's going to be unbearable, because we're so ruined, basically, aren't we? We're spoiled rotten in the West. So how do you envisage this? How would this play out if, say, we just all cut back in 5%? That's very modest in our consumption.
Right. Yeah, 5% would be a good start, I think. And if we think about that at an individual level, for a lot of people, 5% would be literally unnoticeable. People are buying twice as many clothes now as they did 20 years ago. They could cut the number of clothes down by 50%, and most people are not really going to be suffering. Most of the clothes we buy now don't make it through a year before they're disposed of. It would be pretty painless, I think, for most people to cut down their consumption, or many people certainly in a place like the United States, to cut their consumption by 5% or considerably more without having personal suffering of any real kind. The economy, however, would respond quite differently. And so that's where I think we need to look at what are the kinds of changes we can make in the system that allow us to move towards a lower consuming society and economy, but without it leading to disaster. And companies like Patagonia are, I think, showing providing some sense of what that might look like. Business models where there's less focus on growth. There's more attention paid to producing products that last and are durable and that create durable relationships with the products. Focusing less on the production of new things and more on the circulation of already existing things. Maintenance and repair. There are all these other sectors that we might be able to revive that will still provide economic energy, but will allow us to reduce our consumption. Ultimately, do I think that means that we would end up with a smaller, slower churning economy? I mean, I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question, but I think the answer is probably yes, that we ultimately have to right size the economy to make it sustainable. But at the same time, I think that an economy, I don't think that we have to go back to the Stone Age, right? I mean, we can create a much more sustainable economy without having to sink into the collapse of civilization, which I think a lot of people think is our only alternative.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to say something here which might sound a bit kind of like reactionary, but the first thing you notice when you're a foreigner coming to the States, harkening back years ago when I came, is the excess factor. When you get here, you notice extraordinary sizes of food portions. You see all the stuff that gets thrown away, even at a dinner table or in a restaurant. You see an inordinate number of TV sets, tons of cars parked outside people's houses. And then this Christmas tree factor that I noticed, where entire houses are lit up and offices with nobody in them. And I was struck that struck me as so odd. There was this bottomless pit of stuff and it was all free. You could just waste it. So I thought after the pandemic, there might have been some sort of long lasting lessons from that. Were there any at all, or was it just this little blip? Well, what actually happened during the pandemic to us as consumers?
I think early in the pandemic, something really important happened when people were locked out of consumer culture, and before consumer culture had reoriented itself to allow, open the doors to people to consume again. And that, I think within that window, a lot of people did have an opportunity to revisit their values and priorities, and even just to get a bit of a breather from 24/7 commercial culture. So certainly what I'm hearing from people is that, I should say, it's not really surprising that ultimately we went back to consumption. I mean, most of us now have grown up since birth as consumers in a consumer society. There are all kinds of powerful forces that encourage us to consume. It's what we know, it's how we form our identities, as I said earlier. We use it for so many things that I think it was very easy for people to go back to the comfortable embrace of consumerism. But what I'm hearing certainly is that a lot of people are doing that this time with mixed feelings and with some ambivalence about returning to full throttle consumption.
I hope you're right. I do see a lot more evidence of people buying used clothes, I have to say. I've seen stores setting up in Boston where all the clothes are vintage, but they're used.
Yeah.
And I spoke to one woman that was selling her stuff, and she said there's a great demand now for used. So suggestions about resetting the dial here for a moment. You mentioned voluntary simplicity in the book, in Japan, the example you used. Could you tell us a little bit about what you meant by that?
Well, voluntary simplicity is a practice really of deliberately reducing your consumption. The half of it that's not usually talked about is that it's also a practice of shifting your value set from one that's centered on income and possessions and social status to one that's more focused on intrinsic values, as psychologists put it. And those are things like developing strong relationships with people you care about, or connecting with the natural world, participating in your community, mastering skills, developing a a sense of an authentic personal identity. And a big one is becoming involved in issues that are larger than yourself, like social justice or the environmental movement, things like that. So if you look at people who practice voluntary simplicity, which I did, spoke to people in a number of countries around the world who've been practicing voluntary simplicity for decades. And that really is, that's in the absence of being able to take pleasure and meaning from consumer culture to the same degree, a lot of people invest more of their effort in these sorts of values. And the other thing that's interesting about this, of course, is that psychologists who study these value sets point out that materialistic values and consumeristic values don't tend to make us happy in the long run. And they don't provide us with that sense of well-being. And this other set of values does. So that's kind of if we imagine what a lower consuming lifestyle or world looks like, then it's probably one in which more of us invest more of our time and energy in the pursuit of those kinds of values. On the other hand, it's very difficult. You noted that people are starting to buy their clothing from thrift stores and things like that. That's quite a powerful trend right now, and Generation Z is quite a big part of that. But my own generation did that as well. I grew up in the 1990s in Vancouver, and particularly on the West Coast of North America, with grunge fashion and things like that. We were all shopping at thrift stores. We had uncooled consumerism. We were rejecting big corporate brands and swearing we were never going to drive an SUV. Most people, there are movements like this periodically throughout history. They don't succeed. We always end up, I think, at the height of that movement in the 1990s, 1 in 5 Americans was saying that they had reduced their consumption, and they had done so happily. But that still leaves 4 out of 5 Americans that weren't doing that. So then it's very difficult to spend your lifetime as an outsider in your own culture. And combine that with like a $600 billion advertising industry and all of the other forces that encourage us to consume. It's very difficult for us to do this as individuals. And that's why I think we need to look at these kinds of system level changes that can help make it easier for all of us to consume less. Changing the way we do business, changing something as simple as putting, in theory anyway, something as simple as putting lifespan labeling on products so that when you pick up 2 sweaters and one is more expensive than the other, you can see, oh, this one's more expensive in part because it's going to last 10 years and this one's going to last 10 wears, right? So if you think about those kinds of changes, they're concrete, real actions that we can take that will transform the actual system rather than loading it onto the individual to feel bad about, which is the approach we usually use.
So that's a very good point, because I was about to say, well, that certain government measures have worked very effectively in the past. People didn't like them, but like rationing after the Second World War worked super effectively. When I was around, I have to remember the 55-mile-an-hour fuel, speed limit. That worked very effectively to cut our oil consumption. People don't like them, but if they could treat the climate situation like the pandemic, with that sense of urgency, then the government could maybe step in and say, for example, have that mandatory labeling. That would make a big difference, that you have to label your goods with a carbon emission footprint. And a durable good. What's a durable good? It used to be like 25 years. When did it change to being 5? Who said that was okay? The government must have okayed it. They must have. So,
or at least failed to not okay it.
Right.
But
laissez-faire.
This, I think, is this to me is is really the crucial point, is that ultimately we consume a lot because we've created a system that strongly encourages us to consume a lot. It's if you think about it, it's kind of absurd for us to criticize even ourselves for being over consumers when that's our primary role in society. And when we slow down, when we don't do it, our presidents of nations and prime ministers of countries will come out and actually ask you to get back and go shopping. Obama did it. George W. Bush did it. Tony Blair did it. They will incentivize, they will, if enough people stop shopping, they will cut checks and send money to households to spend. So we shouldn't be shocked that in a consumer society, we end up as consumers. We should transform the consumer society into something different. And we can do that, I think, incrementally through these sorts of concrete actions. So lifespan labeling is just one example, but you see things like Sweden has drastically reduced taxation on repairs so that it becomes more likely that a person's going to get a product repaired than to replace it. If you combine that with something like right to repair legislation, which President Biden has actually spoken of, in which companies would be mandated to produce things that could be repaired in many more circumstances than they are today, you start to see how an actually different kind of economy starts to emerge, where people are buying things that they keep for a longer period of time, and they maintain and repair them because that's the economically sensible thing to do. And you can make transformations like that in a kind of every sector of society.
Yeah, there are a number of very sustainable cities around the world. I mean, Amsterdam is actually one of them. And I think it's now not possible to buy a new pair of jeans in Amsterdam. You have to buy recycled, repurposed denim, and they collect jeans from people and then reconstitute them. So I just think that's a great concept. When people realize how much damage is done to the environment to produce one pair of jeans, maybe they would rethink, do I actually have to have? And then they'll pay an exorbitant price to get a used looking pair of jeans. It's kind of
there's that. But I mean, I think there's again, I'm always supportive of these kinds of efforts to reduce the impacts of the things we buy, for example, by making sure that the jeans are made with recycled products. But there's still the mindset that's a concern, right? That you could, if we're buying an ever greater number of recycled jeans, we're still not really getting anywhere. We've probably slowed down our impacts, but the impacts are still going to accumulate over time until we start to hit some kind of sense of sufficiency around jeans. How many jeans do we need in a household?
Exactly. Yeah.
Start to come to some sort of social agreement around what an absolutely absurd amount of jeans is, and what's a reasonable number of pairs of jeans to have in a lifetime.
That's a rationing idea.
I don't think. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to get some of those things sorted out through legislation or anything like that. But I think we get to that kind of a place more through actually having a cultural conversation around overconsumption and its impacts. And we really haven't, the conversation around the actual impacts of the sheer volume of consumption hasn't been a part of mainstream public discourse for about 25 years. And it's really time that we start talking not only about how to green things, but actually how to reduce consumption, and particularly in sustainability circles, which have been so focused for the last 20 years on how to green away the impacts of our consumerism rather than reducing our actual consumption.
Okay, well, this is a very good point, I think, to switch over to Vincent Stanley and include Vincent in the discussion. Vincent's had very long associations with a very innovative clothing company, which probably everybody knows, Patagonia. And they have embraced pretty radical practices for a retailer over the years, encouraging customers away from the throwaway idea and buy less but better. Apparently conservatively, 10% of the annual global carbon emissions originate from the fashion industry. It probably is more when you carry the stuff around. How many of these purchases do you think, Vincent, end up in the bin? And what is the average lifespan? James said earlier it was 10 wears or something, or was it even less?
I think it's about 9 times for fast fashion, but more for regular clothes. But to me, one of the second part of that shocking figure is that the clothes are then just thrown away, not recirculated, not given to Goodwill. But going back to James's point, I think it's one of the things that we've been talking about for several years is how do you change the relationship of a manufacturer to the clothes we make, but also as a consumer, how do we change our relationship to things? Because if you have that dopamine moment, the moment at which that piece of clothing means the most to you is when you put your credit card across the cash and wrap. That's just an invitation to a cycle of dissatisfaction and waste. So how do you change the relationship so that you honor the things that you actually buy, you keep them a long time, they're good in the first place, you repair them? So we've talked about that quite a bit, and I think that has begun to enter the conversation. There's one other thing I'd like to talk about, just about the consumption in America, which is really quite distinct. Consumer contributions to the economy are at 70% in the United States, and it's about 50% on average in Europe, which means that those countries are spending far more on social services. The government is a bigger part of what creates the economy. And it's something that we might be thinking about as we face not only an environmental crisis, but we're facing an environmental and a social crisis, because the levels of inequality have also grown, particularly in this country, to the point where I think you have about 1/3 of the population, probably the 3 of us on this panel, who are doing okay. We can actually live a life that we fairly intend to, but about 2/3 of the people are stuck in lives that are not quite at all what they intended or providing economic satisfaction, those without a college degree. So what you have is you have this disproportionate level of consumption in the United States within the economy that creates the kind of frenzy and the kind of waste that you noticed when you came over from Europe. And then within the United States, that spending is highly disproportionate among about 1/3 of the population. So how do we bring that into the conversation as well? It's not a question of reducing consumption as much as it is of adopting a more sane approach to life, one that does bring satisfaction and one that does address this extraordinary social and environmental crisis that now manifests itself in different ways in every year. It isn't episodic anymore, it's chronic. And we can't look away from that. We have to deal with it. And in the process, as James pointed out, when we've had consumption drop at points of disaster, we're going to be facing more of those moments. So how do we figure out how we're going to adapt our lives so that we can mitigate those harms and at the same time open up our lives to something that doesn't involve consumption and transactions for so much of the day.
So Patagonia were always pretty pioneering as a company. You had a French, was he French or French Canadian founder?
A French Canadian from Maine, though. Yes.
Okay, from Maine. And you and he wrote this book, The Responsible Company. So what is it that are what are the main tenets of a business that is responsible? And is that concept growing fast enough?
It's interesting. That's also in the conversation. So an organization like the Business Roundtable, which is made up of the largest publicly traded companies, last summer, 2 summers ago, announced that they were disassociating themselves from the Milton Friedman thesis, which was very famous in 1970s, basically said the only purpose of a business is to earn a return for the maximum return for its shareholders. And these companies, regardless of how they execute on this disassociation, have said, no, a business is responsible to its stakeholders. Stakeholders defined as employees, customers, communities you operate in, the environment itself, as well as the health of the business. If the business isn't healthy, you can't pay your bills and you can't do the rest of it. So the elements of responsibility that we talked about were precisely those elements of responsibility to the various stakeholders. How do you take care of your employees? How do you be a responsible citizen in a community? That's basically what the gist of the book was about. And then we presented, Yvonne's a very practical man, so the last 60 pages of the book were checklists on what business people could do in order to change their practices to be more responsible. One last point, just I'm reminded of this, that we chose that word very carefully. And there's a wonderful, from James's part of the world, Haida leader named Gerald Amos, who said that the most important right we have is the right to be responsible. And I think this applies to governments, individuals, and communities and NGOs, that sense of, if you want to feel oppressed, put yourself in a position where you feel that you can't be responsible for your actions or for the actions you take on behalf of your family, et cetera. That sense of agency, that sense of connection to the world around you is really absolutely critical.
So here's Patagonia making pretty high-end products. No doubt about it. Not everyone can afford to go into Patagonia. But what are you offering, and why would I go into Patagonia instead of Primark?
Well, I think going back to another point James made, you might go into Primark or you might go into Uniqlo and see something that looks very much like a Patagonia jacket, but you really can't tell from looking at it on the shelf how long it's going to last, or what the social and environmental practices were that went into making that garment in the first place. Clothing is much cheaper than it was in 1970. Not only is it more prevalent, if you look at inflation, it's much cheaper than it was 50 years ago. And a lot of that low price has come on the back of the environment and consumers. So what you might do is say, okay, I'm not going to have 2 jackets this winter from Primark. I'm going to have 1 jacket. I won't say it's from Patagonia. We'll say it's from a small Swedish company or someone else, and I'll keep it longer. That's my investment for the winter. Or you might say, I want to take a holiday. I can't afford that new Patagonia jacket. I'll buy a used one that has a lot of life in it, but maybe it's 2 years old. Or if you're going skiing, and I'm not sure we have this in place yet, but if a good ski jacket costs $700. Rent one. If you need one. Yeah, rent one if you need one for a short period of time. This is part of what we need to do to change the conversation. It's not just, I'm going to go out and buy a $19 t-shirt, wear it 9 times and throw it in the dustbin. It's maybe I can't afford not to buy something that's better if I want to change the way my relationship to the things in my life and feel responsible to the betterment of the world.
I love that you mentioned that. I'd never heard of that before, borrowing it or renting it, because somebody said to me yesterday when we were talking about this, they said, when was the last time you heard somebody say, I'm going to save up for that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I couldn't remember the last time I heard somebody say that.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. That whole concept of deferred gratification is completely gone. Anyway, let's we have got some questions coming in. I've got some more questions for you there, but about workers and actually workers' conditions, which I think is pretty important in this equation. Urs says, for some people, shopping and visits to the mall are highly satisfying. Does being environmentally responsible have sufficient emotional pull to trump the urge to shop? It's a good question. Either of you can, or both of you.
Go ahead.
There is lots of alternatives. I mean, I think even in the pandemic, we saw when people, certainly in my community in Vancouver, when people either were choosing not to go to stores or could not go to stores, culture pretty quickly reinvented itself around gathering in parks and eating and drinking. And in fact, it was illegal to do the drinking part, but culture accepted that in this circumstance. I mean, it's very clear that people were finding that deeply satisfying. As the pandemic went on, there was more and more of it. People just getting together and making conversation. I mean, there's also, for the sake of my book, I went to a borough outside of London called Barking and Dagenham, where they're playing out the world's largest experiment in participatory culture. And what they've done there is an organization has set up actual shop fronts on the streets of the borough. But if you go into these shops, there's nothing to buy, but they can connect you to literally dozens and dozens and dozens of ways, free activities you can do, opportunities to learn, ways to connect with your community, ways to participate in your community and the creation of a sense of community there. And their goal is to make it so that any person in Barking and Dagenham can wake up and have all of these things available to them as alternatives. Well, I mean, certainly to many people, that would be at least as satisfying as shopping. And there's a critical difference, which is that with this participatory culture, it doesn't exclude people who can't afford to go shopping as a recreational activity. And so that's why Barking and Dagenham was selected, is because it's the poorest borough in the London area. And there were a lot of people there who they're not earning enough money to do consumer activities. And so they're doing a whole lot of nothing.
That's wonderful. That's very, very inspiring to hear that. Because before I go to you, Vincent, if you want to answer, on Sunday, I happened to be out going to a museum, and I passed an enormous shopping mall, and the parking lot was full. And I thought to myself, my God, imagine if, everybody there was out planting a tree instead of shopping or doing something else. It's as if there's this kind of cathedral of consumerism now, and people flock to it. It's like it's an addiction on the weekends. So I think this is tremendous, this idea of substituting through the shop urge an alternative activity. I think that's amazing. It's a great idea. Vincent, did you have anything to add to that?
No, not much, except, there have been a few books about, 2 or 3 books about how in environmentally devastated areas, mushrooms and fungi move in to take over, and life in a disrupted place comes back. And one of the things I've noted where I live in Santa Barbara is that the old Main Street is pretty derelict right now. And I've always avoided the mall. I hate malls. But for some reason, I had to go out, and I started to notice that all this life had come to the mall. They had a farmer's market. There were bands. There were people of all classes and incomes who were gathering there, but it wasn't just for shopping. The kind of life that had gone on in the main street was now taking over in the mall, which I thought was very interesting. And malls are suffering because, well, for one thing, the apparel business is in the tank, partly because everything is overproduced. When you talk about people throwing clothes away after 9 wearings, manufacturers burn what they don't sell. So the malls are actually looking for more things like theaters or more things that are actually not consumer goods spaces because they can't accommodate. None of this stuff gets sold at full price, and if you don't sell it at full price, you can't pay the rent. So anyway, I just offer that as a kind of I really noticed that when I saw it. I said, this place feels alive, and I never would have suspected it.
Mm. You mentioned mushrooms. I'm going to add something here. I was reading about a company called Allbirds. This is a radical little company.
Mm-hmm.
And their slogan on their products is "Your outfit is killing the planet."
Yeah.
And each of the labels has a carbon emissions score, which lets people know straight away the climate impact of their purchase. They make shoes out of trees, laces, recycled bottles, and then Stella McCartney's latest line of clothes are made from mushrooms. I don't know if you've noticed this. So the sustainability notion is taking off. Another group, Homespun Homegrown, is a little UK company that's growing its own flax and wool with the idea in a regenerative farm environment. So it's carbon fixing. And it's trying to stop us importing everything from China. And they say they want to rebuild the supply chain using local workers. Now, that's my big question next is what happens about all the workers supposedly that are going to go out of business and be destitute if we did cut back on fashion consumption?
Well, 97% of all clothing sold in the United States is imported. And the workers are in Vietnam and China, they're in Colombia, they're all over the world, in places that are in the earlier stages of industrialization. So what happened with China became the exporter of the world's clothing on the coastal cities. But once you established China established industry, the apparel industry is very primitive and not very profitable. So that industry was chased into central China, then it was chased off to Cambodia and Bangladesh. I don't know what the overall implication is, but the situation of the apparel worker, it's very difficult to get people treated fairly. It's difficult to get a living wage paid. And I'm not sure that this is long term, it wouldn't be better for most workers in the apparel industry to have a better job. So
do you make your products in the United States?
No, we make very little. We make, like everybody else, we make t-shirts and very simple clothes can be made in the United States because we've lost the productive capacity and we've lost the textile capacity, partly through laws passed in the 90s, GATT and NAFTA. So we import from very high-end factories whose labor practices we vet very carefully, and we vet their environmental practices. But we're sourcing from around the world. And I really don't think, ultimately, I think what will happen is the two dirtiest industries, looking at it in one perspective, would be apparel and agriculture, textiles and agriculture, because they have not been, the oil industry is much more efficient than the apparel industry. So is the automobile industry. There, a lot of thought has been going into making things very efficient that also tends to bring about a lot of environmental improvements. When you're talking about apparel, you're still talking about people taking a lot of time to make a garment to fit the human form. And I think eventually you'll have machines doing a lot of that work. And when you have machines doing a lot of that work, it makes it more possible to bring a lot of that work back on shore. In Europe, it would be bringing back the production from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. In Asia, it would be bringing back production to Korea and Japan from the countries that are less advantaged.
Well, certainly that's the thinking behind that small company in England, is that they're going to want everything to be sourced and made locally.
Right.
And so I think that has to move up in terms of our priorities.
The interesting thing is they're all very small scale. And I think that that's a good thing. But I think what you want to do is to develop more small scale businesses. Patagonia is kind of beyond that. We do some small scale recrafting or using used cashmere to make a new sweater. But there is a potential to create kind of artisanal clothing locally. I think a lot of it is going to be very expensive, but
it will last.
It could last, and it changes the relationship to things because
you have less of them.
You have less of them, but also you have the potential to have something that's really made for you in some way, personalized.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, I just wanted to jump back to that, just add something basically to this issue of work overseas versus local, and that's just that I had a conversation with the CEO of one of the factories in Bangladesh that makes a lot of fast fashion clothing, and I approached him because I thought this is a person who's going to push back against the idea of reducing consumption or making more durable goods, because his factory makes the opposite. His factory makes cheap and disposable goods in Bangladesh and employs a lot of people doing it. The person I ended up contacting surprised me. I mean, he had precisely the opposite attitude towards this that I anticipated. He himself said that he felt that bringing fast fashion to Bangladesh had been damaging to Bangladesh because it puts a downward pressure on incomes for garment workers, to the point that people often think, well, we're giving these people a job. He said that in the apparel industry in Bangladesh, people are paid a low income, not only at a global scale, but at a Bangladeshi scale. So these are poor paying jobs even within Bangladesh. He feels that it has come with pressure on Bangladesh to reduce or eliminate environmental protections. Ultimately, he came down on the same side that I am, and that I think Vincent is, where you want to be making fewer but better quality things. He thought that would slow the pace of work for his employees, that they would feel prouder of the work that they produce, that they would feel like their work was valued by consumers over here. I mean, I was quite surprised to hear from him that they're aware that we're buying the stuff that they make with their labor for at fill a bag sales, where you stuff a bag full of stuff and pay $25 for it. They're aware that this is happening, and they feel like it's they feel a loss of dignity around it. So ultimately, he said, even if it resulted in fewer factories, if the end was fewer factories with people with living wages and better quality jobs and more environmental protections and so on, that would be a fair trade-off for a country like Bangladesh.
I read the same in an article, the BBC Today, interviewing someone from an Indian factory, said the same thing, that ultimately would be better for the workers. they wouldn't work under such pressure, they get paid more, and they produce better products. Okay, a quick question came in. Michelle's concerned that fossil fuel companies will ramp up plastic production as gas and oil consumption drops. Clothes are made from fossil fuels, so won't the pressure be on to increase production? I think she means produced by fossil fuels. Anyone got an answer to that, or want to throw a?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't know that there's going to be a lot of pressure on apparel companies. It's polyester and nylon are two fabrics that we use. We're getting away from the use of virgin fossil fuels and going to 100% recycling as quickly as we can for those two items, for those two fabrics. But the point that Michelle makes is quite true, that there has been a lot of increase in plastic production for single-use packaging and for spreading single-use packaging around the world. It wasn't common in Asia until 10 years ago and has now produced big problems.
Last few minutes. Greta points out they're getting into upcycling in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and they participate in what's called generous culture, settling unwanted items, setting them out for others. Can James speak to these practices? Do you know anything about that upcycling?
Yeah, all of these sorts of issues like upcycling, recycling, sustainable production, all of these approaches are important and can they potentially make a valuable contribution. My concern is that if what they do is sustain overconsumption, if we maintain the same attitude toward consumption, then I think it's very difficult. I spoke to a t-shirt manufacturer in the UK who has effectively sorted out how to dissolve clothing and turn it into its base components, either nylon pellets or a cellulose material that can be respun into. So you could basically put t-shirts in this system and take t-shirts out the other side of the system. But I said, well, if we continuously need more and more and more t-shirts, does this work? Can a circular economy deliver that? And she said, well, no. I mean, at a certain point, you have to add resources to the circle, if you're just going to continue to grow things. And we can upcycle things, but if we continuously want more and more things, then upcycling is also going to need to add new materials to the mix in order to meet that consumer appetite. This has been the problem. This has been the frustration with green consumerism over the past 20 years, that almost everything that we use and make today own, and everything we do today is we can do it more sustainably than we could, or do it with more sustainable products than we could 20 years ago. And yet the end result hasn't been a reduction, like an absolute reduction in the consumption of almost any natural resource. So at some point, we need to face up to the fact that it's not just a question of whether the products are sustainable or unsustainable, or their production is sustainable or unsustainable. It's a question of, can we actually reduce our consumption? Because we just can't, our attempts to green consumption and have not been able to keep pace with how fast our appetite for consumption has grown.
Right. You actually had a rather kind of a sad note in the book. You said you can be the change in the world, but it will not change the world. And I assume you mean by this, it's not enough on its own, that you want. Won't this encourage people to give up, though?
No, I mean, that is a pessimistic moment. But I mean, right after that, I do say, I mean, that's just me being realistic as a journalist. History has shown us that we keep coming to this place again and again, where there are these movements that say consume less, and then 10 years later we're consuming more. And I think it's because we put the responsibility for reducing on the individual, and there's only so many of us that are going to do that, and so many of us that are going to sustain it. We need to combine that focus on personal change with a focus on changes in the system,
Right.
and then we might actually see the potential fulfilled in our interest in reducing consumption.
Well, gosh, this hour just flew by. I don't know. I felt like there was a lot more that we could cover, but we covered a lot. So thank you so much, James MacKinnon, for making the time, and Vincent Stanley, and everybody that joined us for today's discussion, the day the world stopped shopping.